In 1939, the Second World War began between the Allies, which include the Soviet Union, Great Britain and France, and the Axis powers, Japan, Germany, and Italy. The United States had made great efforts to stay out of the war with the Neutrality Acts in between 1935 and 1939. Even with the Neutrality Acts, the United States still lent more support to the Allies over the Axis. On July 26, 1941, the United States put a trade embargo on Japan after the invasion of Indochina. Japan lost 3/4 of its overseas trading and 88% of its oil. The Japanese then responded to the embargo by planning a surprise attack on the United States. In 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor during a surprise attack that results in the death of over 2,000 people and the sinking of 8 United States Navy ships. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt ordered the United States into World War II. The attack left American military officials in fear of a mainland invasion from Japan. Soon after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which authorized Japanese internment. Fear and public pressure contributed to the internment, but Japanese Americans still fought for their right as United States citizens. The mass destruction at Pearl Harbor created immediate fear of Japanese spies. The day after the attack, Capitol Hill to address a joint session of Congress. As he entered Capitol Hill, he was greeted with applause even from the Republicans. The attack on Pearl Harbor had united Congress. The president then delivered a speech asking Congress to declare war on the Empire of Japan.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Within an hour, the Senate and the House had acted upon the president's request. As Americans band together against Japan, they also turned their back to Japanese Americans in the United States. As Americans moved into the war, the common people began losing their trust in Japanese Americans. On the West Coast, Japanese Americans suffered from pay cuts in agriculture. People began refusing to go to Japanese-owned stores and started refusing Japanese trade. Despite the Fourth Amendment in the Constitution, the homes of legal Japanese American residents were entered and searched. The public pressure and already existing racism left Japanese Americans turned against by their community, friends, and people they grew up with. The reaction of the citizens living on the West Coast accounted for the internment of Japanese Americans. Public outcry and political pressure called for something to be done about the Japanese problem. Majority of the people who voiced the need of internment were California natives, laborers, and farmers, who had long viewed Japanese immigrants as social and economic threats. The cry was for removal of anyone of Japanese ancestry, whether they were a citizen or not. The argument was so strong it had reached the House of Representatives. Congressman Rankin stated, "I'm for catching every Japanese in America, Alaska, and Hawaii now, and putting them in concentration camps. Damn them. Let's get rid of them now." Japanese families and communities were rounded up and jailed and forced to sell all their property to prepare for relocation. Immigrants from Japan first came to the Pacific Northwest in 1880s. The first generation immigrants from Japan and Hawaii came to the West Coast to begin working on the railroad. After the building of the railroads, Japanese Americans started families and businesses. As they began to conform to American culture, more opportunities were in place for them. They were willing to work for lower wages than most Caucasians. Because of this, protests against Japanese began to form. This shaped the public opinion of Japanese immigrants. In the camps, many Japanese Americans began forming their own music groups, gardening clubs, newspapers, and sports teams. During their internment, many Japanese Americans fought against the institutionality of the internment. After 2 years, internment camps slowly closed and the internment ended. In the 1970s, Japanese Americans and their supporters began a decades-long redress movement that pressured Congress and the President to apologize and provide compensation to the surviving internees in 1988. The attacks on Pearl Harbor that resulted in the internment of more than 100,000 Japanese Americans are similar to the attacks on September 11th in New York, when 2 planes crashed into the Twin Towers and 1 plane crashed into the Pentagon. After the 3,000 Americans that were killed, Americans band together against Muslims in the same way they did against Japanese. The United States military began mass efforts to find out who organized the attacks. The public response to the attack was with many hate crimes against Muslims. Muslim Americans began living in fear of hate crimes as the FBI led investigations on the attack. Eventually, Al Qaeda was faulted and Osama bin Laden was killed. However, the violence toward Muslims still